Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome again to our stories of West Florida and Pensacola and the North America's first place city. Now today and through this series we are talking about what I call the Spanish-French confrontation, the struggle between France and Spain along the Gulf Coast as each one of these countries attempted to create a permanent settlement and a way to enlarge their empire on this continent. We've talked about the arrival here in the year 1698 of the first Spanish at Pensacola, and then the following January, the coming of a colony led by the French-Canadian brothers Iberville and Bienville, which of course landed and talked with the Spanish here, and then went on to begin the establishment of what the colonists would call Mobile, Biloxi, and Dauphin Island. And that's where things stood at the beginning of the year 1700. We went through the year, and the Spanish were having terrible times. They had no physician with them, and they began to suffer all sorts of medical problems, so that some of the days only half the people would have been fit to work. And things were just going so badly. And at this point in time, Arreola just didn't know what to do. And of course, he wasn't connected with CNN or email or anything like that in those days, so news traveled very, very slowly. And what he didn't learn quickly was that late in the year 1700, poor old King Carlos finally died. Now the question was, who is going to be the new King of Spain? There were two quick candidates, both of whom by marriage were related to the original Spanish house. One of these was the Duke of Anjou in France, named Philip of Anjou, and he, through relationships by marriage, had a contact and a tie with the Spanish throne. The other was one of the princes of the Habsburgs. Well, these two obviously were at odds, and while the council wanted to settle this peacefully, they couldn't. The French put an army in the field to back Philip. The Austrians put an army in the field to back the Austrian prince. And consequently, we began a very lengthy war, which in Europe was called the War of the Spanish Succession. Now, we won't detail in our story here a lot of what happened on the battlefield, but it was a war that went on for more than 12 years. But in the meantime, both of the French and the Spanish were trying to set up shop here, and about the middle of the year 1701, Arreola got a message. He was ordered to attack and capture the French possessions here along the coast. Well, by now, Iberville and Bienville had succeeded in reinforcing both Mobile, Biloxi, and the others, and they were making good friends with some of the Indian tribes, the Choctaws, and what some call the Pensacolas. They were getting on well, while the Spanish were having all the troubles of lack of food, lack of manpower. But now Arreola got a message from the council: you are ordered to attack and capture the French positions. Well, Arreola realized this was ridiculous. He had the manpower, but what he did was take the one little ship that the Spanish had here. They put a number of soldiers on it, and they sailed west and anchored in the base, in the situation there at Biloxi. And he put down a very carefully ordered message to Bienville, who now was in charge there at that post, ordering him to surrender. Well, of course, Bienville was only 22 years old, but he was smart enough to realize that this was pure bluff. He realized that what the Spanish had and how much superior his force was. So instead of beginning a fight, he invited Arreola to come in to parley, to have a little lunch together at the local club, which Arreola did. They had a wonderful time together, and both realized that each one of them had met the demands of their government, and they could now go away in peace and not fight each other. Well, that ended that for the moment. Arreola got on his vessel and moved again back toward Santa Maria de Galvez, or Pensacola, and he got about halfway there. This, of course, was in the month of August, and everyone, of course, who lives along the Gulf realizes what we are likely to have in August. And sure enough, a very severe storm struck his ship. It was badly damaged, and he had no choice but to limp back to Biloxi, and with his tail between his legs, and ask for help. And again, Bienville said, by all means, bring your ship in. We'll help you get it squared away. And they did. And then Arreola moved back toward Pensacola. At this point in time, he found it possible for himself to go back to Mexico with a report. and he wanted to lay out in front of the viceroy just how things were really going here, how bad it was, how bad the manpower was, how the French were just able to take them over if they wanted to. And he also wanted to point a finger right at Father Seguin and say, how could you possibly have picked Pensacola as the place to settle? And this became, if we had had the press, the media as we have now, this would have been a front page story, because these two men almost fought a duel over this, but fortunately they did not. And Areola was now temporarily at least replaced in the governor's role by a Sergeant Major Martinez. And so things began to move ahead, and slowly, a year at a time, the war is going on in Europe, but is not affecting us along the Gulf Coast at all. We go through 1702 and 3, and we get into 1704, and things are just beginning to look a little better. We still don't have no women, we still have no clergy, no schools, of course, but things are looking better. And then in the month of March 1704, a fire broke out, and it burned everything that the Spanish had built, except the fort. It burned everything right to the ground. It was just a total disaster. So they had to begin all over again. And as they did so, Areola returned, and he was very critical of what they were doing, saying they were trying to build the buildings too large. This was wrong, that was wrong. But nonetheless, they proceeded on, and they got into the month of August, and again, this is 3 years after their previous adventure on the water. And now, once again, a serious storm. I don't know whether it was a hurricane, but it might have been. It came along and literally tore the roof off everything they had been building, and once again, the poor people had to start over again. Well, as all this was proceeding, the situation was such that we now see a little more interest in Indian tribes, because one of the things that had come out of the Spanish settlement at St. Augustine was a sizable mission at Appalachia. That's about where Tallahassee is today. And these Indian tribes were moving back and forth along the coast. They were trying to make friends with the Spanish and the French, and it was reasonably successful. Not great, but reasonably successful. And then we move into 1705, and by 1705, the English have gotten into this war of Spanish succession. They have a different name for it now in Europe. We don't worry about the name, but the English now are involved as well. They have begun to make attacks against St. Augustine, and now the English, under Governor Moore of Carolina, decide they're going to do everything they can to drive the Spanish and the French out of the Gulf area. So they begin to put together in our time we would call these terrorists. They were sizable groups of Indian braves led by red-coated English officers. And they would come across the area and literally hide in the woods, and then when the Spanish or the French would go out into the fields to try and till their crops and do what they had to do, they would be attacked, and the results were devastating. Well, you can imagine what it was like. Here, you're a farmer trying to do your thing, you're out there hoeing and weeding and doing what you have, and suddenly the Indians come sweeping down at you. Tomorrow you're not too inclined to go out and do your work. And basically this begins to hurt agriculture here and, of course, in Mobile. So beginning now, about the year 1705 or 1706, both Mobile and Pensacola begin to come into a period when they have serious food shortages. And trying to get additional supplies out of Mexico becomes part of the reports that we share with that period, because both France and Spain were having the same problem. And basically the food, much of the food that did come to the Gulf came out of Mexico from the port of which in De Luna's time we call San Juan de Ulua. By now they have changed the name to Veracruz. Now, about this time, and we can't put a date on it, the name of the settlement here on the Gulf, what we now call Pensacola, begins to be called Pensacola. And people often ask, well, where did the name come from? Well, every historian that I've talked with recognizes that there are three possibilities. One is that it might have come from the presence nearby of a tribe, a kind of an offshoot of the Choctaw Indian tribe that was called the Pensacolas. It was not a large tribe, it had very little settlement here, but nonetheless, that might have been it. Another possibility is that along the shore of eastern Spain, about 60 miles south of Barcelona, there is a little fishing village that has been there forever, and it is called Peniscola, Peniscola. And a lot of people said, well, maybe there were people from there that had come to this settlement, and they had been here, and they didn't like Santa Maria de Galve because that viceroy had now gone, so they wanted a new name, and they chose it, and that might have been it. Another man a man who was one of the first real scholars in our Pensacola history, a man who ran an academy here about 1900. Professor Armstrong said, no, that neither one of those is right. He said, you have to put two and two together. In musical terms, the word cola is at the end of a musical phrase. And he said, if you take a look at the peninsula that goes across from east to west here, and we call it now the Santa Rosa Peninsula, but it was a peninsula. So he took the word for the P-E-N from that and the cola from the musical term, and he put the two together. He said that's what it was. People there just put those two terms together, and they made Pensacola. Well, I don't know, and I don't think anyone wants to take a life-threatening oath on which one of those three possibilities, but nonetheless, about the year 1705, we begin to call this Pensacola instead of Santa Maria de Galvez or Oshus as it was way back in De Luna's time. Okay, the attacks continue, things go on, we go from year to year to year, and finally, in the year 1713, the War of Spanish Succession finally comes to an end with the peace of what they call the Peace of Utrecht, and the country settled down. And now, from that point forward, for the next few years, Pensacola gets a little bit better. We begin to see a few women sent out. We begin to see the population rise, and one story says that there, at this point in time, about 750 people were here, which is much larger, of course, than we had in the earlier days. We move forward, and now the French are taking a little different view of all this. They're saying, well, we've grown a reasonable amount, but not the way we wanted to. And now in France itself, a man who might very well have fitted to 21st century America has an idea. This man said he wanted to start a development company that would sell shares and make it possible for people to buy real estate in France, be in France and buy real estate in North America, and try to bring people there as investors. This man was named Crozat, C-R-O-Z-A-T, and his idea was backed by another government official who was named Cadillac. So you put Cadillac and Crozat together, and they've got this idea, and they begin to they make an impression in French America. Crozat comes, and literally he becomes the head man for a time in French America, and Bienville, who is still there, becomes the second in command. And so that development proceeds along here through the next couple of years. About this time, 1715, old King Louis XIV dies. And of course, this throws all of France into an uproar. His great-grandson now is going to be the king as Louis XV, but he's just a little boy, and he's under a regency. And in Spain, we have Philip V, who was, of course, had been the Duke of Anjou and made the successful king after the War of the Spanish Succession. He's there, and now by the time we get into a little bit later time, we get into the late 1717 to 18, Philip begins to have new ideas. He figures, why should I not be just king of Spain? I'm eligible. I would like to be the king of France as well. And so things begin to work. The machinery begins to go for a new war between France and Spain, which would be fomented basically by Philip. All of this, of course, is taking place without a whole lot of effect here in North America, except that by now we have a new governor. Juan Pedro Matamoros, who was a soldier governor, arrives, and Governor Matamoros recognizes that his city here is not very well positioned for defense. So he begins not only to improve old Fort San Carlos, but also to build another fort, a smaller fort, across the Narrows, about where Fort Pickens is today. And he calls this Fort Sigüenza. So as we end the year 1718, we have a larger Spanish force and a large French force, but no one is aware yet that there are hostilities coming, and those hostilities will come in our next episode.